The word static is used a lot in Java, and it can be very confusing. So I would just like to spend a moment talking about the meaning of the word static when it comes to fields and methods. In order to do this, I've given you another bit of code. This is called fixed capacity stack of strings 2. And I've added a couple of static members to this class. These members give a stack ID to each stack. So in my code, I can say, well, this is stack number 0, stack number 1, etc. So let me just show you what this code does. I'll run it and look at the resulting output. And what you notice immediately is at the very beginning of my program, I don't just have a main method. I also have this variable floating by itself in a yellow box. This is the static variable numstacks. Static variables are not allocated with objects. They're separate, and you can think of them as being shared by all the members of a class or all the objects of a class. But for us right now, the important feature of the keyword static on a field is that the static field is stored at the beginning of time, and it's not stored with the objects as they're created. In fact, if we run through the code, we'll notice that the objects do not have a field called numstacks. So by putting the word static here, I change the location of the field. It's no longer stored with the object, it's stored once for the entire class. The idea of numstacks is that we're going to give each stack its own ID. So after I've created 2 stacks, I'll have stack ID 0 and stack ID 1, and the number of stacks is 2. To understand numstacks, let's go back in time just a bit to the point where the second stack is created. So at line 42, I've already created 1 stack, and let's just walk through what the constructor does for the second one. So I'm creating a stack with capacity 3, and what we've done here is given each object an additional field called stack ID, which is initialized to 0. In the constructor, what I'm going to do is store the current numstacks into the stack ID, and then increment the number of stacks. So this will store 1 in the stack ID and change the global variable for numstacks to 2. So you can see that happening in the execution here. Right, where in one fell swoop on that one line, the stack ID goes from 0 to 1, and numstack goes from 1 to 2. So that's a static field. What's a static method? In order to show you this, I'm going to create a static method here called numstacks and use it to print out each stack. The method printPop here is another static method. It takes a stack of strings as a parameter and then will print out stuff before it pops everything. So let's watch this one execute. When I call printPop, note that we have the parameter s, which is first bound to stack 2. So we have s bound to stack 2. We're going to print out this stack. The first thing we'll do is go to get the stack ID. When we do that, we invoke the stack ID method. Note that stack ID is a non-static method. So we have a this parameter, which tells us which stack we're talking about. Of course, in this case, we're talking about the stack with stack ID number 1. So this will return value 1 back to my printPop code. And at that point, we'll have the ID variable set to 1. We're then going to invoke the numstacks method. And when I invoke numstacks, note that numstacks doesn't have the this pointer. It's not invoked on a stack at all. It's invoked simply on the class. When we invoke numstacks, what's going to happen here is it's simply going to return the variable numstacks, which of course here is 2. And so what we're going to return is the value 2. And we'll store that here in the num. So you can see the two variables, num and id. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what static variables mean. They are stored separate from objects, and they're shared by all the elements of the class. Static variables in Java correspond to global variables in other programming languages. They are stored once and shared. The main point of this example is to understand the different classes of storage in Java. You can see it as having 3 classes. There's static variables that are stored with the class. These are actually allocated when the class is loaded. So the details of this are sort of beyond the scope of this course, but classes are loaded before any code from that class is run. Non-static variables, the regular sort of fields inside of an object, so non-static fields, are stored with the object. And those are allocated when the object is allocated using new. Local variables inside of methods are stored with each method invocation, and those are allocated when the method is called. So that's the variables and how they work in Java. For methods, the keyword static really indicates whether or not you have access to the this pointer or not. So static methods do not have access to a this pointer, whereas non-static methods do.